Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I'd like to talk about modernism versus classicism, or more simply stated, modern versus classic values in fragrances. Now, this is a bit of a different discussion than saying vintage versus modern made fragrances or vintage versus current, because we're not talking about the literal age of a product here, when it was made, when it was released. We're talking about the aesthetics, which means that for some of you folks who live in your own little solipsist world where perfume died after 1990, the queen is dead, long live the queen, or whatever, right? This is a conversation that you might not really feel comfortable with. And, honestly, I don't care. I'm all about cracking the door open further and expanding minds. I'm not about closing off to things or building a wall around myself and saying that everything outside of my bubble doesn't exist, And I'm not saying that, again, you have to necessarily like fragrances made after a certain arbitrary cutoff point. I'm just saying that this particular conversation that we're having is not limited by the year of release or the materials used in the fragrance or any of those tick boxes, if you will. We are talking about aesthetics, and you can apply aesthetics to anything with any materials during any time, which means there can be classically styled fragrances made in the modern age right now, this very second, as we speak. And likewise, there are fragrances that can be from times past that feel modern to us now, that still, after decades, feel modern because of the way they were constructed. You can look at architecture this way. You can look at music this way. You can look at film this way. You can look at a lot of the houses that Frank Lloyd Wright designed and say, oh, those still look modern, right? Because of how they were designed. You can listen to certain songs made in the 80s or 70s using analog synthesizers, but because of the nature of the music, the way it was designed, it still feels futuristic, right? Therefore, it still feels modern in a sense, okay? There are a lot of things in old science fiction, like Blade Runner, that still resonate as modern today because of the aesthetic value applied, correct? You see the world of Los Angeles in Blade Runner and how dark and grimy it is and how mechanical everything feels, and a lot of that is still seen in stuff we find today out in the world, right? A lot of sharp, angular buildings, sheer walls of glass, right? Well, that is an idea that's been circulating for decades now. It's not new. We have a lot of buildings that were built in the 50s that still look modern now. So, therefore, these are aesthetic values that don't necessarily appreciate or depreciate in time. They can, but they don't have to. So, with that a little bit out of the way, now I want to task you with telling me, what do you think makes a fragrance modern versus classic? Now, I know there are very defined meanings for modern and classic. If you have a dictionary handy, Oxford, Webster's, whatever your flavor of choice is, you can pop open that dictionary and say, okay, well, according to this, modern is defined as blah, 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 blah. Okay, again, I am not a solipsist. I am not trying to redefine truth for anybody here. I'm not trying to reject your reality and impose my own, because unfortunately, whether you like it or not, we all share the same reality. All right? So there are certain personal things that you can say are a personal truth, but 1 + 1 always equals 2, and A is always equivalent to A. All right? There's no getting around that. So I'm not trying to redefine the words modern or classic. I'm merely asking what in a fragrance for you makes it feel modern versus making it feel classic. I want your perspective. I want your unique insight and your opinion, warts and all, okay? So whether you despise modernity, reject modernity and embrace tradition, whether you hate old-timey stuff and you are always living in the future, you want the next, latest and greatest, whatever your particular spin on things is, I want it. I want to know. I want you to tell me, okay? And as long as you're able to tell me without judgment or criticizing my opinion, just giving me your own, present it as is, if you will, then we're good. I'm happy. I got what I want from you. Now, let me give you my 2 cents. What do I think defines a modern fragrance versus a classically styled fragrance based on the definitions of the 2 words and based on what I see, what I perceive in a fragrance that makes me go, that feels modern versus that feels classic. I come from a musical background. One of my biggest hobbies before I got into fragrances was music. Also film to a lesser extent, and video games and tabletop games too, Dungeons and Dragons or a simple game of checkers. If it sits on a table and has pieces, I probably like it. I'm not a big chess fan though, but I like most board games, and I like a lot of video games going all the way back to Atari. Okay, I like films going all the way back to the golden age of Hollywood, so I do watch some silent films too, all right? Harold Lloyd is really good. I like his stuff. So my thing is, though, since I'm coming from primarily a musical background, I kind of equate a lot of things to musical analogies. So for me, modern and classic are almost like analog and digital. But reverse that, though. In this case, modern is digital, analog is classic. And if you're someone who's into music, whether you're a musician or just like an audiophile and you do like home entertainment, amps and all that, speakers, you know what I'm talking about. Classic fragrances, in my opinion, they take a complicated and labor-intensive analog approach to creating a perfume. So they start with a block of marble and they chip away at it slowly. And they whittle it down and whittle it down and whittle it down, making a lot of mess on the floor. It's a subtractive process, okay? They start with something bigger and chip away at it until it's smaller, but it's filigreed and carved and beautiful. So that is typically what I find to be true with a lot of classic perfumes, like fougères, like chypres, like orientals, where they have a basic structure, all right? Big globs of materials, bunch of oak moss, bunch of patchouli, bunch of bergamot, bunch of musk, okay? And then they're slowly reducing the doses of these materials and adding in other materials. Okay, let's build a floral accord on top of this. Let's build a citrus accord. Let's play with some spices. Let's dial back how much musk is here and add a different kind of musk. Let's make 30,000 different revisions of this fragrance and spend years making it, right? Let's put 5 years into this. Let's put 6 years into this. Let's just do the most labor-intensive, experimental way possible until you've walked away with like 1 billion different versions, but you're finally happy with one. And then that becomes the fragrance. That becomes your Jiki. That becomes your Shalimar. That becomes your number 5, okay? And it's number 5 because, Ernest Beau had like 20 of them. And Miss Chanel picked the 5th one. So, number 5, okay? That's my point. That's a classic way of doing things. Like woodworking, okay? Like sculpting, okay? You see what I'm saying here? Like traditional coach building for a car, all right? Same sort of deal. It's a subtractive process in many ways because you start with a big block of something and you whittle it down and refine it. It can be an additive experience too because you add in joists, you add in bumpers to the car eventually. It's not entirely subtractive, but a lot of it is subtractive. And it's labor intensive. It's very difficult, okay? And you get very complex, abstract subjects that are composed of lots of ingredients, These classic formulas, like the Guerlains, the Carons, the Chanels, all right? These are fragrances with like dozens and dozens of materials in them. Their formulas are very complicated, very long lists of materials, okay? Now, at the same time, during that same time period, you had companies like Avon, of course. I'm trying to think the fragrance Trailing Arbutus by Avon has only 6 materials in it. And that is also a fragrance from that classic period, if you will. It only has 6 materials. But keep in mind, it's also an Avon fragrance, or California Perfume Company, whatever. It was made to cost. And in those days, right, back then, you didn't have a lot of chemicals. You didn't have AI back then either. You didn't have computers to store anything for you. So the way they had to cut costs was the number of materials and the time spent. So in those days, if you wanted to make a cheap perfume, you didn't have cheap materials and you didn't have computers to assist you, so you just made simpler fragrances. You made them simpler and you made them quicker, less revisions, less time spent. Throw it together, it smells good enough, boom, out the door it goes, and it's on the shelf now, okay? That's how you got cheap back in those days. Quick and dirty, quite literally, quick and dirty was how you did it back then, because you didn't have all of the cost-cutting tools that we have now. But even those fragrances still can feel classic to some people, because even though they are simpler and they're quicker and they're dirtier, they're still done in a way that's a bit on the subtractive side, because you start with big globs of stuff, and again, you reduce and make room and add things in. You toy and you tinker and you experiment until you go, okay, chef's kiss, it's done. Whether you're spending a week on it, a month on it, or 6 years on it, whatever. On the flip side of that coin, you have modern. Modern fragrances, and a lot of modern anything, feels like it is built using advanced processes, okay? The tools are more expensive when we're dealing with modern stuff, when we're dealing with fragrances built primarily with aroma chemicals, built primarily with computers, like the stuff being done at Firmenich with Alberto Morillas, for example, where he's using AI assistants and these computer data banks that have just rows and rows and rows of pre-designed accords, pre-made accords stored. He can just call them down, and the computer like automatically blends them together for him, so he doesn't have to sit there and do this with little droppers. The machine just feeds it through a tube into the thing. So when you have modern fragrances, the tools are definitely more expensive. But you see, that's the trade-off here, okay? With the classic method, very labor intensive, very trial and error, lots of tinkering. With the modern fragrance, you've invested millions of dollars and probably hundreds or thousands of man hours not making the fragrance. No. Not making the fragrance. Making the tools that then make the fragrance. You have spent millions of dollars, thousands of man hours developing the aroma chemicals, developing the materials, developing the machines, the compounders, the computers, the AI algorithms that help you assemble these accords. You have put basically all of your time and attention into the tools with which you use to then very quickly, very efficiently create a fragrance that is almost put together like a Lego castle, like a Lincoln log cabin, okay? So you're like, okay, pull this down, bonk, pull this down, blam, pull this down, blom, mix it together. Computer says, okay, you can't have this much of that, you can only have so much of this, but you can add more of this, bling, blang, blom, bloom. It's done in an afternoon. There's your fragrance. Off to Bath & Body Works it goes, okay? Off to Zara it goes, all right? A client wanted a fragrance, so you took a couple months or whatever to make a fragrance, and you ended up with like 15 different versions of it. So the client gets the one, and then the other 14 gets sold off to everybody else. So one might become an Avon fragrance, right? One might end up, again, as a store brand somewhere. One might become a flanker for a designer who wants a quick flanker. So L'Oreal may say, I'll take one of those, you know? But you see, it's very quick, it's very efficient. And the results kind of speak for themselves, do they not? So modern fragrances are extremely precise. They are extremely calculated. And while they can be complex, like a classic fragrance, they can have lots of materials. Generally, since they are going for optimal efficiency, if they do contain lots of materials, those materials take the form of singular accords, which there are less of in the fragrance than there are other fragrances. So you may still end up with a fragrance with like 20 different unique molecules in it, right? It might have 20 different molecules in it, but there are only like 4 or 5 major accords in the fragrance, because those 20 molecules are divvied up into blocks of 5, 10, 15, 20. So that's why your note pyramid for your market copy has like this, and then the heart is one thing, and then the base is one thing. And that's it. Okay? You can still create things that are beautiful that way. I don't think modern fragrances are necessarily less beautiful than classic ones. They're just beautiful in a different way. Okay? So a classic fragrance, clearly, is beautiful in the way an old chapel, an old Gothic cathedral is beautiful, or in the way an old castle, like at Balmoral, for instance, is beautiful. Handcrafted, labor-intensive, very delicate features, very detailed. The only way you can make something like that is by hand like that. You cannot make that with a computer. You cannot make that with a bunch of backhoes and other, equipment. That has to be stone laid by hand, brick by brick, stone by stone, mortared in by hand. All the wood is cut with plumb bobs and stuff to make sure it's level. There's no laser beams going on there, buddy, okay? That's how you build something like that. And that's how you walk away with a Shalimar with, again, a number 5. Okay, that's how you walk away with a fragrance like that. Then you got stuff like, the Sears Tower, which I guess is now called the Willis Tower, right? Okay. That was designed almost entirely by computers. Granted, computers from the 70s, okay, but still designed by computers. Very angular, very sharp, okay? A lot of your brutalist buildings that people don't seem to like, and I understand that particular architecture is not really favored right now. Maybe in 20 more years it'll get revived again. But but a lot of these modern buildings, okay, like the Burj Khalifa, okay, in Dubai, very modern. Designed by computers, everything, every arch, okay, every beam, every angle, every surface is calculated with such precision that it might look more plain to the person who favors the classical lines. It may look boring to the person who favors the more filigreed approach. But for someone who appreciates efficiency and elegance of design, the sheer elegance of there are only this many pieces and they all fit together so perfectly that this thing can stand, right, without falling down. That's the kind of person that's going to appreciate a modern fragrance over a classic one. That's the kind of person who's going to appreciate something like gentle fluidity, where there's 2 different versions of this fragrance. There's a silver and a gold, and both of them are made with the exact same materials in different ratios with much different results. That right there is probably the epitome of modernity right there. I'm going to leave you on that note. Maison Francis Kurkdjian, love them or hate them, the gentle fluidity pair, silver and gold, same materials for both fragrances in different ratios to create 2 entirely different experiences that you would not even realize were related if it wasn't on the packaging. That is probably the epitome of modernity right there. And a lot of his stuff is arguably very modern. Not all of it is good. Not all of it is good, but all of it is ostensibly modern. And likewise, there are classic fragrances being made right now. A lot of stuff that Darren Allen and Manny Cross put out is very classic. A lot of stuff Andy Tower puts out is very classic. If you're willing to spend the money on it, Raja Dove, his name is Roger Bird in real life, but Raja Dove puts out a lot of classic fragrances. Very classically minded, very complex, lots of materials. You're going to pay a pretty penny for them because he puts them in the fancy bottles and gives the fancy caps on them. But my point is, those are definitely classic fragrances, okay? But they're made right now with today's materials. So it works both ways. These are not timestamps, people. These are just methodologies and thus aesthetics. Now, that's my opinion. I want to hear yours. This has been The Unlist, and thank you for watching.